Greetings all! With the German invasion of the Soviet Union now in full swing over on the World War II channel, it is now time to dig into how the workers and peasants' Red Army dealt with the question of how to use the new invention of the tank during a period of time in between World War I and the onslaught of the German forces in Barbarossa. And no, it's not they invent deep battle, they discard deep battle, Zhukov uses deep battle, they go back to deep battle, they then kick the Germans up the Volga. If only it were that simple. It's enough to drive you to drink. This has not been a task I've been looking forward to. Most other nations had the good sense to let politicians deal with politics and the military could deal with tactics. France is the obvious asterisk, but other countries, the effect of politics was normally a case of limitations. We will limit your budget. We will limit oil imports, that sort of thing. The Soviets, though, that wasn't the case. And doctrine and politics were intertwined. If you did not incorporate proper revolutionary thought into your doctrinal proposals, it may not be taken seriously and you may end up dead. Even if you do incorporate proper revolutionary thought, you may end up dead. If you choose the wrong branch of it, or if you make the wrong enemies. And unfortunately, understanding proper application of Krieg is to me a lot easier than understanding the logic of Bolshevik theories of how humanity works. It's all very well to hand wave it and go straight to talking about deep battle, but it's a lot more difficult than that. Have another drink. If you're under 18, this is apple juice. If you're under 21 in this country, it's apple juice. I don't understand it. I know the logic, I know the history, it's not stupid. Anyway, seriously, when a military theory postulates that the reason that the French military had so many tanks was a lack of trust of the proletariat which made up the ranks of an army, such that machines with their small crews were considered less likely to rise up against the bourgeois leadership, you know you're in for a brain scrambler. And that wasn't the only problem. So declining birth rates also lead to a lack of moral force because there simply aren't many soldiers in the army. The authors may not have necessarily believed what they wrote, but they certainly believed they had to say it, lest they be taken out back behind the shed due to lack of revolutionary fervor. So, even now, after a couple of goes doing the research, I'm still not entirely sure I have my head wrapped around it correctly. Thus, for this video, I'm leading with the caveat that this is how I understand it, more than this is how it was. If anyone can do better, more power to them. At least things start to get a little bit simpler after the late 1920s. And it's not as if they get complicated, they start out complicated. Remember that the tank came about at the tail end of the First World War. That also happened to be about the tail end of the Tsar's rule. So not only are we talking about new technology, we're also talking about an entirely new army. The Russians started the war with a relatively conventional conscript military, but in addition to radicalized regular military, the Bolsheviks had the Red Guards. Now, these were basically groups of citizens rallied around a common purpose. There were no ranks, decisions were made by elected committee. Still, the combination of the two forces did work for a while. The first order of business of the new regime was to protect itself against the inevitable counter-push from the forces opposing the Reds. Now, these would turn out to be the Whites, which weren't a unified group per se, but they were unified in being counter-revolutionary. This was done with the creation of a body with the catchy title of All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for the Struggle with Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. In Russian, forgive this attempt, Trezvyczajna Komisarya po Borbe I Kontrrewolucji I Sabotażem. And they needed a catchier nickname and it got shortened to Cheka, the secret police organization which would become a terror of both the citizenry and the army both. In any case, the second thing done was that the Tsarist army was to be demobilized. The Red Guards would fill in the gap while the creation of the Red Army, a militia of the peasantry, would happen. In the meantime, of course, there was that little disagreement going on with Germany at the time. No problem, thinks Lenin, we'll just declare peace for everybody. Doubtless the imperialist powers, i.e. UK and Germany for example, will ignore this, and that shall demonstrate to the proletariat of those nations the inherent natures of their leadership, and thus it shall foment revolution. Unfortunately, the Germans actually did decide to make peace with the Russians, which, face it, was a pretty obvious thing for them to do, so they could then focus on the Western Front. And Lenin's envoy, a chap by the name of Trotsky, was kind of left holding the bag. Trotsky did what any good believer in the revolution would do. He denied the Germans their peace on the grounds of very harsh surrender terms, believing that the German lower ranks would not follow their aristocrats in a war prolonged purely by their greed. To his consternation, however, it turned out that the German lower ranks were actually quite willing to follow their officers when the Germans took the Russian lack of acceptance at face value and continued the war. It also turned out, unfortunately for Lenin's mob, that no matter how inspired the members of the Red Guard and the days-old Red Army were by the revolution, it turned out that the maximum effective range of revolutionary zeal proved to be somewhat shorter than that of the Gewehr 98, firing a 7.92 by 57. This led to two things. Firstly, the Germans gained more ground in 5 days than they had in 3 years. Secondly, it led to a stunning realization that perhaps it would be a good idea to have people who actually knew what the hell they were doing staffing the army. The call went out to comrade soldiers and former officers to come back to the colours, well, new colours, and the idealism of the Red Army died about a month into its existence. That call also went out at the higher levels, and senior Tsarist officers were brought back in as vojenspetsy specialists. They weren't particularly trusted. They were given minders in the form of political commissars who held a level of command authority as well. However, they did vaguely know what they were doing, and the Soviets were fairly desperate. So desperate indeed that the idea of elected positions and an absence of ranks was abolished in mid-1918, and anybody who didn't like it was a counter-revolutionary and would be shot. Now, interesting though this all is, and it can be quite a topic of independent research if you want to go learn more about the Red Army's formative years, all this has basically nothing directly to do with the development of Soviet armored doctrine, especially given that neither Russia or Germany used tanks against the other. But it does kind of set the stage for the problems inherent in creating the doctrine. It was one thing to rely upon the advice of the Tsarist officers for fighting the Germans, and then later the Whites, but it was another thing entirely to rely upon them to create the future doctrines of the Red Army, poisoned as they were with their imperialist dogmas. Thus, unlike basically every other country where senior leadership generally kept hold of the reins, the direction that the Red Army would go would be dictated by, in effect, rank amateurs jumped up quickly to replace the legacy commanders as soon as possible. There would be one or two exceptions, but you can kind of get the gist of the problem. Then again, I guess one could argue that the Red Army similarly would not be tied back by reactionary old guards who didn't trust these newfangled tanks. Instead, however, the Red Army got new guards who didn't trust these newfangled tanks. The first Soviet experience with tanks came in the Civil War. This was basically a case of the blind fighting the maimed, small, often rarely coordinated forces fighting against each other, but the tanks arrived in March of 1919. The initial responses of the Red Army were not fantastic. Soldiers tended to just run at the sight of the things. At the higher level, the Red Army staff expected them to be used as they were on the Western Front in 1918, as that seemed to be the general model for the things, but on the ground the Red Army did fare poorly against them. Eventually though, White forces reversals, to include the loss of Taganrog in early 1920 where the British Army had set up its tank school, resulted in the Reds gaining a couple dozen tanks of their own. Then the Red Army had to figure out what to do with them, and the result was to create the auto tank detachments of 3 tanks apiece. As with most early tank usage, they tended to be used simply to create a breakthrough, whilst cavalry and maybe armoured cars would be used to exploit it. That was just a tactical concept though. Actually operating them was another matter entirely, and the question of finding people mechanically adept enough to send to and then run an armour school was not a priority for the leadership. It took until September 1920 before authorization was granted. In the meantime, horse cavalry was performing very well indeed, being fast, effective, and not particularly prone to mechanical breakdowns. And thus it was that the first real doctrinal manual for the things, Instructions for the Employment of Tanks in the Worker Peasant Red Army, written by a chap called Kotovsky in late 1920, really was just a rehash of the British manuals in 1918. Low speed, small range, need for specialist supplies, mechanical unreliability, all that sort of thing. All they would be relied upon would be for smashing defensive positions, and infantry and cavalry could proceed on through. Kotovsky obviously felt he needed to write practical doctrine for the tanks such as they existed, not as they could be in the future. When discussing armoured cars in another manual, which were faster, more reliable and longer ranged, they would be used as cavalry would be, causing havoc in the rear and used in pursuits. Tanks were considered to be a supporting unit like artillery, and as such they would take their orders from a single combined arms commander, normally infantry. In the middle of all this was an expedition west through Poland. More of the proletariat would rise up in revolution if the Red Army could get to them. Whatever. Suffice to say, the two sides came to blows. A couple of names that will strike the listener as being a bit familiar. The two main thrusts came from the northwestern and southwestern fronts. The northwestern front was run by a bloke named Tukhachevsky, the southwestern by Yegorov. Well, at least in theory. Yegorov had a political commissar to share command with, a chap by the name of Stalin, who, curiously, wasn't as convinced that the Polish soldiery would be any more likely to rise up in revolution under the aid of the Red Army than the Germans had been 2 years earlier. Under Yegorov was a hugely effective 1st Cavalry Army under the productive leadership of Semyon Budyonny, and his commissar was Klement Voroshilov. All was going outstandingly for a while until quite simply the Reds ran out of gas, more or less at the gates of Warsaw. Not gas literally, but gas as in ran out of steam, the metaphor. The USSR was not in the greatest infrastructure shape to begin with, and simply wasn't logistically capable of succeeding in the war. However, that did not stop acrimony from being creative. Budyonny's move to capture Lviv with Stalin's permission, instead of helping Tukhachevsky, did not sit well with the latter. If only Tukhachevsky knew where the future powers would lie in amongst all these various names. Finally, in all this, the Soviet Union did build its first true tanks. 15 FT clones, the Russian Renaults, copied from captured examples, came off of the production line in Somerville in 1920. They did not see combat, but it was a start. In 1921, the first real steps of making an armour branch happened. Up until then, armour was considered a subset of the engineering branch. Since engineers aided the advance of the infantry, and tanks aided the advance of the infantry, it kind of made sense, even though artillery controlled the guns on the tanks, which again wasn't unique to Russia. Again though, here, the Soviets aren't yet building tanks, they're really just playing around with what was captured. The new chief of Armour Inspectorate, by the name of Lunishky, teamed up with Kotovsky and submitted that armour needed to be its own directorate. And also, military requirements required an increase in the size of the branch. Not that the Director of Engineering was pleased, but they won. Mid-1921, Armour was created as a separate directorate, with the director, to be Kotovsky, reporting to the Chief of Staff of the Army. A training brigade was authorized in September, but trained them on what equipment and doing what? Until those answers were provided, the military would probably have to be informed by whatever was going on in the UK and France. In the meantime, the Soviet Union had enough problems simply sustaining itself, let alone armour units. Tanks ended up being used as tractors for agriculture for a while. Manufacture of tractors was not enough to meet requirements. How can such a nation improve its tank force? It couldn't. 1923, a review of armour forces noted the developments abroad, and that, for example, France and the UK had tanks numbering in the thousands. There may have been something that they knew that the Soviets had missed. Kotovsky recommended increasing Soviet tank strength from 80 to about 1,500, organized in batteries of 4 to 6 tanks, flotillas of 3 or 4 batteries, divisions of 5 flotillas, and squadrons of 4 divisions. With artillery and naval terminology like that, one wonders whether or not they were paying a little bit too much attention to the writings of Fuller. They were, however, still looking at the tank as a breakthrough vehicle with thick armour and a big gun, not so much as a vehicle of manoeuvre. This suggestion was calculated to be a financial expenditure on the order of, "You have got to be joking," rubles, and so it didn't go anywhere. Instead, in 1924, Armour Directorate was disbanded and folded under the Artillery Directorate. Cheers. Also going on in 1924 were some changes in the command structure. Mikhail Frunze, a dedicated enough Bolshevik and a generally successful commander of the Civil War, gets made Chief of Staff of the Red Army and head of the military academy. There comes a power struggle on the future of the Soviet military between Trotsky on one side and Lenin and Frunze on the other. Trotsky thinks attention should be paid to other nations and leans, together with his legacy specialists, towards what we would consider today to be a conventional attitude to the military. Frunze envisions a state of eternal class struggle, with the solution coming not with specific technical capabilities or tactics, but from the strength of the ideological convictions of its army's personnel. Frunze also envisions an offensive role for the Red Army. If the purpose of the Red Army is to either come to the aid of uprising revolutionists or to create the conditions for those uprisings to happen, that means a focus on the offense, as opposed to Trotsky's emphasis on the use of the army as a defensive asset to secure the nation. Stalin, seeing Trotsky as a future opponent in the power struggle, throws his weight in with Frunze. Tukhachevsky does as well, although more because he is more against Trotsky's vision than for Frunze's. Eventually, Trotsky is forced out, and Frunze's vision of the army being a cadre-based militia of all workers and peasants, as opposed to a professional, large, well-funded army, wins. Besides, as mentioned, there isn't the money to make it a well-funded army in the first place. The Red Army's size plummeted. Now, again, this isn't directly related to the development of armour in the Red Army, but I use it to illustrate just how bloody crazy the whole situation is that people are trying to develop tanks in. The Frunze reforms undertaken in the short time before he died are well worth looking into independently, but for now we'll just focus on two things. Firstly, though he didn't believe that the solution to Doctrine lay in technology, he was absolutely aware that technology was hugely important. Communications, tanks, so on, were going to be an issue. He had been on the receiving end of better equipped enemies too many times. Secondly, he took a long and hard look at the Great War and concluded that the next war would be one of attrition, not lightning fast blows. In this, the conclusion is similar to that of France, but unlike France, the solution was to embed military needs into society as a whole, with all domestic decisions being made with a reflection of how it would help the Red Army achieve the global revolution. By way of an example as to how these various issues aren't quite so clear-cut, we can have a look at Alexander Andreevich Svechin. The name should be vaguely familiar. He's the guy who invented the concept of operational art, the middle ground, as it were, which developed between strategy and tactics, which we take for granted today. He, too, believed that the next fight will be based on attrition, but believed it necessary for that attrition to be a defensive operation, bleed the enemy as they attack. That did not sit well with those who believed in offensive wars. Unfortunately for Svechin, he had started his career as an officer in the Tsarist army, which saw him sent to the Gulag in 1931 during a purge against those associated with Trotsky, which would have included former imperialist officers. Cheers. Operational art was implemented in Soviet practice by Triandafilov, but that's outside of the scope of this talk. Regardless, there was something of a chicken and egg scenario. Much like France, the Imperial Russian army emphasized the power of the bayonet as being the decisive part of war. The Red Army, as mentioned, believed that the mass of motivated peasants and workers was decisive, and as such, other arms, such as tanks and artillery, had to be subordinated to them. Which, face it, was fine. The Soviet Union couldn't build tanks even if it wanted to. Field Service Regulations of 1925 deemed the tank mainly captured ones of course at the time, a strong mobile source of firepower which cleared obstacles from the infantry's path. 1926 saw the development of a 3-year plan for Soviet tank production. The tank to be produced was T-18, also known as the MS-1, Light Support Tank Model 1. Originally made with a combination turret with a 37mm, similar to that of the FTs on one side and a machine gun on the other side, by 1930 the tank was coming with a bustle into which a radio was to be installed. Never was, but obviously they were at least thinking ahead. In the end, almost 1,000 were built between 1928 and 1931. At about the same time, Stalin was able to push for a 5-year plan with the aid of the 1927 war scare. Started in 1928, this industrialization was to meet the needs of the Soviets against the intended attack of the imperialist opponents. The military requirement was submitted by the Chief of Staff of the Red Army, now Tukhachevsky, and it consisted of infantry supported by strong artillery, strategic cavalry, and aviation. No particular need was stated for armour. Also in 1926, the Germans started negotiations with the Soviets for development of some joint experimental centres. One for poison gas, one for aircraft, and one for tanks, the latter at Kazan, codenamed Kama in Germany. However, the lack of tanks built by Germany meant that the establishment would not be up and running until 1928. The Germans hoped to get more tactical and technical experience of running the tanks, which they were not allowed to run. The Soviets were hoping to learn technical details to help them build tanks in the first place. Finally, in 1926, Tukhachevsky, who had been proposing an idea of continuous operations, where one operation would link into another without pause for supply or consolidation, probably as a result of his 1920 experience heading for Warsaw, ordered a 2-year study entitled Future War. The conclusion was that the Soviet Union would require huge numbers of motorized troops and tanks. There were no revelations as to how they would be used, but the inability of the Soviet Union to make them in the first place was obvious. So in effect, the request was, get us the tanks and the trucks and we'll figure out what to do with them afterwards. Unfortunately, old rivalries came up. The war commissar at the time was Voroshilov, who you will recall was the commissar of 1st Cavalry Army when Tukhachevsky needed them, and it led to some bad blood. A conflict between the two came about with regards to the relative powers of the Red Army General Staff and the War Commissariat, and Tukhachevsky lost. He resigned and was sent away to the Leningrad Military District. While there, though, he conducted experiments with his concept of the continuous operation with multi-echelon forces, including artillery, tanks, and aircraft. The first proper maneuvers using tanks were in 1928 in Kiev, and were basically a disaster. Nobody had a clue how to use the tanks or how to work with them. That shouldn't be a huge surprise. There were hardly any operable tanks they were trained with beforehand, and even the command structures were not really still known. In the meantime, another role for the tank was developed, reconnaissance, and this started the Soviet obsession with light tanks. Rather than light tanks being just another form of infantry support, 6 would be sent to the rifle regiments as reconnaissance assets. For this, the Bolshevik plant in Leningrad in 1929 came out with the T-17, also known as the Lilliput tank. Apparently taking some inspiration from the French Cagresse modifications to the FT, this turretless tankette came with rubber tracks. It did not enter service. Neither did the T-12 medium tank, a 20-ton monster with a 45mm gun built at the end of 1928. Enter also, in 1928, preliminary instructions for the battle use of tanks in the Red Army, written by a friend of Tukhachevsky, Kalinowski. This was probably the first time that the use of independent armour was postulated, with some tanks being used for the close support of infantry, and others being used with cavalry and artillery, penetrating deeply into the enemy's rear. Again though, this would have been more theory than practice. The Soviets still had no tanks with which to do it. In 1929, some Gross tractors finally arrived at Kazan, and the joint schools started. With only 10 officers from each country around, plus engineers and the likes, the Germans were getting their practical experimentation done with tank construction, but the Soviets weren't getting the level of technological information that they were hoping for. In the meantime, the T-18 had its combat debut against the Chinese, a company of 9 of them partaking in the eventually successful retaking of the Chinese Eastern Railway. But the fact that it took the Soviets 4 months to come up with an effective response did not go unnoticed in Moscow. A desire to open up the taps on military capability, especially tanks, resulted. This was an opportunity for Triandafilov, now Chief of Operations Directorate, to stick his oar in with a paper entitled On the Red Army System of Tank Tractor Autumn Armour Weaponry. God love these catchy titles the Russians come up with. Anyway, he proposed following in the footsteps of the UK and the USA and creating an experimental mechanized force to try to figure out some of the problems of using the internal combustion engine, which was obviously starting to improve military capability in leaps and bounds. And indeed, an experimental mechanized regiment was ordered to be created in the summer of 1929, and it partook in maneuvers later that year. However, he did openly state that he had no solution to the problem of infantry and armour moving at different speeds beyond just attempting to coordinate their actions at whatever distance apart they happen to be. He distinguished between the need to have troops able to keep up with the tanks and the troops able to fight with the tanks. As he saw, units of tanks and self-propelled artillery would outflank the opposition through breaches, but since tanks were not deemed capable of holding ground, which was a doctrine which lasted in many countries many years, infantry would be brought along following to do the job of holding. So we're not talking about quite the harbour concept of Fuller, but it's actually fairly similar. Since the average Soviet road bridge was good for about 8 tons, that set something of a high-end limit for standard tanks and tankettes. Medium tanks would be brought along for set-piece attacks, breaching fortified zones. Even these were limited in weight by the capacity of Soviet railroads, which wasn't all that impressive. These planned new, light, reliable vehicles had the capability of merging with Tukhachevsky's continuous assaults and Svechin's operational art. Also in 1929, Triandafilov wrote The Nature of Operations in Modern Armies. The continuous linked assaults, not just being a repeated hammering, would be a formed part of an operation. Tanks could help both with making the initial breach faster, as well as lighter tanks and trucks being able to conduct the pursuit in depth. Emphasis on the word help, though. The tank was not the core element of the force. Everything was still to support the large mass of the army. Bear in mind, though, support in this case doesn't have to mean close support right next to the infantry. It can, but it can also mean conducting operations completely independent from the infantry if necessary, which still aids the infantry in its task by setting the correct conditions. Enter now Budenyi, stage left. For those of you not familiar with Panto tradition, the villain always enters stage left. You will remember him also from the 1st Cavalry Army in Poland 9 years prior. He was not pleased with this talk of tanks doing raids and pursuits and the like. That was the job of his horses in the cavalry. He accused folks like Tukhachevsky of having fallen under the siren spell of the Germans and wanting to destroy the cavalry, replacing it with motors and aircraft. One had to be careful how you replied to Budenyi. Cavalry was still highly prestigious in the Red Army, and he was also friends with Stalin and Voroshilov. He did not, however, write PU-29, the first major doctrinal instructions of the Red Army. Triandafilov, Tukhachevsky, and others did. Tanks were given 4 possible roles: infantry support, independent missions deep in the enemy's sector in cooperation with infantry and artillery, cooperation with the cavalry on the flanks, or creating breakthroughs. Tanks would have 2 main tactical roles, either infantry support or destroying artillery. 1929 was a busy year. It was also decided that the artillery directorate were perhaps hampering development of tanks. A new Directorate of Mechanization and Motorization was created under the command of Innocenty Kalepski. Kalepski was a technical guy by trade, and he spent his time in the Civil War in the early 1920s in various communications-related positions before being appointed Chief of the Military Technical Directorate in 1924. He may not have been a tactician, but he will have known how to run with engineers and factories, and it was obvious that the Soviet factories were not nearly capable of meeting even the production run of T-18s, let alone anything better. That something better would have to come from abroad, and a shopping list was created. From the Germans, the Vollmer KH-60 wheel-cum track. The British, the Cardinal Lloyd Mark VI and the Vickers Type E. From France, the NC-27, the Americans, a Christie convertible and the T-1E1. In the meantime, work on local tank designs was continued. The T-24 medium tank for punching in fortified lines was ordered in September 1929, with 25 being built in 1930. The 18-ton beast came with all of 22mm of armour, another 45mm gun, and 4 machine guns for the 3 crew. It would go at a fair clip of 24 kilometers an hour before it then broke down, which it would do. Also ordered in September 1929, the T-19 light tank for infantry support, which would prove to be kind of suspiciously like an NC-27's running gear on a sloped armour hull with a T-18 turret. The wheels were now in motion. Tukhachevsky started to let his imagination get a little ahead of things. With the Soviet production system starting to spin up, he started thinking in terms of an army which had tens of thousands of tanks, with battles which could be almost 200 kilometers deep, that distance being achieved by airborne troops to include air-dropped tanks. Chemical weapons would be used as a matter of course. The proposal reached Stalin. Science fiction was the pronouncement. At this point, Kalepski went on his shopping trip abroad to buy some tanks which had been identified as possibilities earlier. For some reason, a number of companies seemed to be suspicious of selling only 1 or 2 tanks complete with blueprints, so they had to buy in bulk. 20 Cardinal Lloyd Mark VI's, 15 Vickers tanks of 6 tons, the famous E's, and 15 12 tons, the so-called Vickers medium, were acquired from the UK. The purchasing delegation then went to the United States to look at the T-1E1 tank. When Christie then showed off his light tank, the Soviets stopped looking at Ordnance's design and just bought 2 of Christie's tanks for $60,000. They also bought the rights to license build the tanks for an additional $100,000. In hindsight, they seem to have gotten quite a good deal. The Cardinal Lloyds formed the basis of the T-27 tankette. Over 3,300 will be built between 1931 and 1934. The Vickers E that became T-26, initially built with twin machine gun turrets, it in effect competed for the infantry support tank position with the T-19. However, T-19 cost 96,000 rubles compared to 42,000 for the Vickers, and the Vickers was superior in almost every respect. T-19 went away. Oddly, the designers for T-19 were not shot. Over time, 1,627 twin-turreted T-26s would be built, about 450 of which were armed with a 37mm cannon in one of the turrets. The Vickers mediums were basically shelved, and of course the Christie was developed into the BT series, production starting in 1932 with either a 37mm gun or 1 or 2 machine guns, some 620 BT-2s being built. This now generally solved the matter of what tanks to build and how to build them. There was one exception: a breakthrough tank still had to be built. That task was given to the design team of the Bolshevik tank plant in 1931. Now all that remained was the question of how to use them. The experimental brigade was stood up in summer 1930 and generally followed the British example. Like most of the early experimental mechanized units, it was a bit tank heavy, but actually not too badly so, with 2 tank battalions, 1 infantry battalion and an artillery battery, and also some chemical and air defense units. Testing was not glorious. For example, the unit was tasked with cutting off a cavalry unit from the flank. The horses were faster and the tanks then ran out of fuel. That said, remember that we're still talking primarily about T-18 tanks here. The foreign designs, which were hugely more capable, were not yet in service. In the meantime, tank regiments were created of 3 battalions of pure tanks. They would be reserves that the infantry units could call upon to help their operations. The experimental brigade was expanded to 2 55 tank battalions, a reconnaissance regiment of 100 tankettes, 2 SP artillery batteries, a battalion of motorized infantry, and some anti-aircraft units. The tankettes, mainly T-27s to start with, soon became a major component of both recon and cavalry units. Not that Boudinot was happy about it. He joined in with other hippophiles in Germany and the USA in thinking that armoured vehicles might be able to assist the horse, but could never replace it. He proposed a cavalry division of 4 horse regiments, 1 artillery regiment, and 1 mechanized regiment. Whether other generals agreed with him or not, they shut up. He had powerful friends. In 1930, the now famous term deep battle was coined by Tukhachevsky in a memorandum to hire. The thinking was that the old ideas of attacking the front until it collapsed, or finding a flank which wasn't always going to be left conveniently open by the enemy, were probably not things to rely upon. Instead, front and rear would be assaulted at the same time. The rear would be attacked in 2 manners. Firstly, by airborne troops, and indeed a parachute kit was accepted for service to drop T-27s from TB-1 aircraft. This wasn't a massive drop mine. When Tukhachevsky created his first experimental airborne company in 1931, it was a 164-man unit but only had 2 T-27s for support. The other manner was of fast tanks, which would not stop the fight in the front line, known as DD tanks. Presumably, casualties were expected. The question of how to have the infantry keep up with the tanks for their fight in the enemy rear area was solved by simply putting the infantry on the tanks. Presumably more casualties were expected. I can only imagine the terror that an infantryman would feel holding on for dear life to a BT-2 as it careened through the enemy lines with machine guns and anti-tank guns shooting at it. Cheers. The front itself would then be attacked by 2 more waves of tanks. One, the DPP, designed to destroy individual points of resistance like enemy tanks and machine guns, and the third wave, the NPP, would be the one supporting the main infantry assault. All this time, the Red Army's god of war, artillery, would be hammering on the opposition, which probably means one more thing for the poor bugger holding on to the BT-2 to worry about. Tukhachevsky also had no particular solution to the problem of coordination and synchronization, but one step at a time. If the deep battle idea had questions of coordination, then deep operations was even more problematic. The deep battle was still basically premised around the area around the front line, 10 to 20 kilometers behind the distance that the supporting units of the enemy were to be found, particularly the artillery. Deep operations required large independent units to go herring off scores of kilometers, if not into the triple digits, resulting in their own unique sets of both logistical and communications problems. 1931 ended with 2 additional important marks. The first was the decision to create an amphibious light tank for reconnaissance purposes. In effect, a tankette with a turret. 2 design bureaus were put on the case. One decided to use as a basis the Cardin 3-ton payload tractor, of which 3 had been purchased in 1930. This became T-33 and then T-37. The other turned into T-41. Both used cork on the sides to aid in flotation. In the end, an amalgamation was made. You take the T-37's hull, the T-41 superstructure, put them together, and you end up with the T-37A. Somewhere over 2,500 vehicles, including 650 with radios, were built 1933 to 36. The other important thing was an airplane crash. Not only was one of the People's aircraft destroyed, Triandafilov and Kalinovsky were killed, 2 of the more forward-thinking folks in the Red Army's structure. How this would affect the future development remains to be seen. The USSR in 1931 was capable of producing a mere 700 tanks a year, compared to the tens of thousands that folks like Tukhachevsky wanted. It is worth considering, however, just how many countries had more than 700 tanks in the inventory of any sort at all. And it's actually a pretty short list. And the Soviets are going to start leapfrogging. The Germans seemed to be of little help. They were getting some technical information on tank construction from the joint operation at Kazan, but the Soviets were learning their own doctrine. Indeed, when Tukhachevsky visited the German maneuvers in 1932, he came back with the opinion that the Germans were being quite conservative and only going as far as partial motorization, not even partial mechanization. Of course, whether or not he saw everything is another matter. The Red Army set about creating its own armoured structure, and in early 1932 decided to create 2 mechanized corps. Each corps would have a mechanized brigade of 3 battalions of T-26s, a rifle machine gun battalion, an artillery battery, engineers, and air defence. Another brigade using BTs instead of T-26s, an infantry brigade, and various corps elements, including aircraft. Now go back over my other videos on France, Germany, UK and Italy and see if any of them dove into all arms mechanization to the same extent. The Soviets are not mucking around here. British and Soviet opinion on tactical use was actually starting to match up quite a bit, except the Soviets are talking corps, or more realistically by Western terms big divisions, when the British are still trying to sort out their brigades. An interesting observation may be that the Soviets didn't go quite as tank heavy as the other countries did in their tank infantry balance, and indeed the 2 mechanized corps were created from infantry divisions. However, it may be as much because of the political ideology indicating that the Red Army's strength was in the strength of its makeup of the people, as it was tactical considerations. Fuller's tank army was the expeditionary strike army of English imperialism. Deep battle was still being thought out, and enter a new chief of staff of the Red Army, Alexander Egorov. Really, he was just refining Tukhachevsky's earlier work, but importantly he was enhancing it, not throwing it out. The idea of a deep penetrating armour force remained, the DD tanks. I can only presume that there was a thinking that anti-tank capabilities would be sufficiently weak that this deep penetration could not be stopped. The distances now though began to increase, with talk of 100-kilometre penetrations, and the idea of aircraft attacking 400 kilometres in taking hold. But this was despite reservations on just how effective aircraft actually could be on their own. If nothing else, they will cause disruption. The practical issues of this theory of operations was picked up by the director of military training, a chap by the name of Sedyakin. As far as he was concerned, commanders have now been talking about deep battle at a theoretical level for some 2 years, but nobody had actually written down the realities of how it would be done. It's all very well to say, an infantryman will be transported deep into the enemy's rear by holding on for dear life to a tank which will speedily punch through the front lines without getting destroyed on the way. But if we go out to the field and we put Private Ivan onto a BT in a field exercise, what would it actually look like? He spent the next 2 years trying to actually nail down the details. One detail which got nailed down was that 30 to 60% of the tanks in the 3 waves would likely be destroyed, and that there might be situations where it would be futile to even try, and we should just go back to the older doctrines. Another detail was that the tanks intended to go maybe as far as 100 kilometers into the rear would run out of fuel at about 30 or 40 kilometers in. The reality being that the tanks, even if fueled up before the battle, would not be running at economical cruise speed for the duration, despite the fact that the sales brochure gave these tanks a 120 kilometer range. In 1933, Sedyakin released provisional instructions for organizing for deep battle, which was the result of this detailed analysis. And in typical Soviet style, the instructions were also very specifically detailed, a bit sort of hominy-esque. Follow the instructions and you'll be fine. Order number 100 of the Red Army staff made deep battle the official doctrine of the army, basically given Sedyakin's manual official sanction. And yes, the old pre-deep battle doctrine still held if the formula for success prescribed for deep battle in the manual could not be met. 1933 started with the Red Army having 5 mechanized brigades, 2 tank regiments, 12 mechanized regiments, 4 mechanized cavalry battalions, and 15 and 65 independent tank and tankette battalions for the rifle divisions. At least those were the flags. The actual equipment was still being delivered. As you can see, they're definitely going heavy into this mechanization business. Soviet-German relations began to sour a bit, especially after Herr Hitler came to power and the Soviets stopped sending their officers to attend a joint facility at Kazan. Since Stalin and Voroshilov were not particularly pleased with Germany overall, and with the results of the Kazan school in particular, other officers weren't allowed to be either. It was bad form to say that the Germans were doing anything well. But in fairness, at this point, the Soviets legitimately seemed to be doing fine on their own anyway. Probably the most pro-German chap was still Tukhachevsky. Well, okay, not necessarily pro-German per se, but he still felt that the Reichswehr did things worth studying. The school at Kazan was closed in September 1933. The 10 German vehicles still present were shipped back to Germany as well. Not that the Soviets really needed them anymore. May Day 1933, a new tank was unveiled to the public. 4 of these 22-ton monsters were paraded on Red Square and 2 in the Leningrad parade. These were the T-28s. Difficult to see behind the plating, but the suspension system on the T-28 is basically nicked from the Krupp Gross-Tractor with 2 triple pair bogies per side. The T-28 is generally overlooked today. It had the archaic land battleship multi-turret thing going, and the armour was unfortunately weak, but there weren't very many tanks out there which had a 3-man electric traverse turret with a full turret basket and a 45mm gun with both telescopic and periscopic sights. When the tank entered production, the gun now had a 76mm. Even the auxiliary machine gun turrets wasn't an obvious deficiency. Look what the British did with the A9 cruiser built years later. And though it also has the powered 3-man turret, A9 did not have a high explosive capable gun to go with its 2 machine gun turrets up front. Basically, Soviet industry had created what had a very good claim to be the world's most advanced and capable tank. They had problems by 1940, but by 1933 standards, T-35 of course would also be produced in 1933, but only 60 were built and the tank was far less successful for a number of reasons. It is also absolutely massive, and I had the pleasure of seeing one in Kubinka, and the thing is a monstrosity. Whatever its technological features, it was ridiculously oversized and under-armoured. So, apparently the Soviets were kind of hit and miss on this success rate. One of the more hits was the installation of the 45mm gun into T-26 and BT. Well, sort of. The gun was never fully semi-automatic. Yes, it is a thing. It has been described as quarter-automatic. The breech would have to be manually opened, but automatically closed as soon as you threw the new round in, unlike a normal semi-auto. What it was a matter of the recoil force of the type of round being fired. AP rounds resulted in the semi-auto function that one would normally expect from a semi-auto cannon today. At about the same time, the BT-2 was replaced on the production line by the BT-5, over 1,800 of them being produced in under 2 years. The T-28s would eventually find themselves assigned to 4 heavy tank regiments, along with the T-35s in one of them, designated to be specialty units to be used where they best fit in support of divisions and corps attempting a breakthrough, in a manner similar to the armoured divisions that the French would come up with some 6 years later for their Char B-1s. The Soviets haven't stopped yet. As the famous phrase goes, but wait, there's more. The Red Army is now on 5,500 tanks in 1933 and the taps are still open. By late 1933, exercises were showing that deep battle was proving easier said than done. There was some thought given to the concept of how to get the deep penetrating tanks past the front line, but not much changed. There was a proposal to make APCs out of T-26 chassis that also never went anywhere. There was even a proposal to combine armour and air under one command, since it seemed that the two branches would have to function closely together. And there were fundamental training gaps. Crews had no idea what they were doing, and nobody seemed to know how to work together. A research group in the Frunze Academy in the meantime was attacking the question of deep operations. At the operational level, the leaning was towards two echelons, one focusing on the front line, the deep battle echelon in effect, and the second echelon being an exploitation force going through the supposedly 40-kilometer gap in the front line as far as 200 kilometers deep before spreading out. Given that communications were liable to be a bit tricky, extremely detailed instructions were now required to be given by Central Command. That way there would be less chance of some subordinate commander herring off and doing something at the wrong time and letting the whole thing topple. There was one minor detail though. For the purposes of the experiment, the group came up with a plan to invade Poland. It made sense. I mean, they're on the border and they were the most recent likely enemy, barring the China skirmish. They then assessed the plan by doing a sanity check and concluded that the Red Army didn't have a hope in hell of achieving it. Capabilities for logistics, command and control, and the general state of the army overall were quite simply not up to snuff. If the army were not capable of conducting operations according to Doctrine, maybe the Doctrine, fantastic though it may be in theory, needs to be discarded in favour of something more practicable. 1934 was spent trying to tackle these problems, and the Red Army was going nowhere with it. The crews still were not well enough trained in simple acts of driving from A to B without having an accident, let alone trying to properly synchronize multiple echelons of tanks in a complicated attack. There was a serious push to drop the middle tank wave and just have the deep penetrating tanks, maybe with the APCs, and the infantry support wave. The defense suppression wave arguably could be dispensed with. The matter of getting troops to keep up with the tanks was still not settled either. One proposal went as far as to drop the rifle brigade from a mechanized corps and replace it with an airborne brigade. The short-term solution was to make the corps a little bit less unwieldy by dropping companies from 4 platoons to 3 and then dropping platoon size from 5 tanks to 3, which also had the advantage of allowing equipment to be distributed more rapidly to more units, which now included a few shock divisions, which somebody had decided to create. These were mechanized infantry formations focused on the breakthrough. They were kind of heavy on equipment and relatively light on sustainment. The T-26s were taken out of the mechanized corps and replaced by BTs. The corps themselves were also reworked to be tank heavy. 3 battalions of tanks and 1 of infantry to a mech brigade, 2 or 3 mech brigades, and a rifle brigade to a corps. This resulted in the main power of the army again reverting to infantry units, as mechanized units didn't have much infantry. On the technology side of the house, BT-7 production started to come online, with better running gear, and notably the tank is now welded. Arc welding also started to be applied to the T-26s coming out of the factory, making the tanks lighter and safer. Relatively speaking, of course, we're still not talking heavy armor here. By 1935, there was still a lack of common understanding as to how to apply the deep battle principles in practice, and still some debate over just how much independence of action there should be allowed to the tank units. Ultimately though, the thinking was still that the infantry were the main effort. The operations of the tanks, whatever they were doing, had to be done in order for the infantry to eliminate opposition, even if it meant intercepting the enemy's operational reserves tens of kilometers from where the friendly infantry were fighting. Things started going pear-shaped for deep battle in 1936. A massive exercise was conducted in Belarus involving 85,000 troops, 1,100 tanks and 450 aircraft. Coordination between tanks and other units was horrible. Tank units often performed poorly even within themselves. Commanders misused their mechanized brigades entirely. The deep penetration tanks were assumed that they would take horrible losses unless supported by substantial artillery. Voroshilov observed that if the solution to getting tanks through was heavy artillery fire, well, good artillery would likely work well for infantry attacks as well, in which case, why are we spending all this money on tanks? The purpose of the tank is to help infantry breach the enemy's defense. The infantry is the primary arm of the service. One may wonder why the Red Army's future breakthrough tank was named after him. Now, this may strike one as being a couple of steps backwards, but Voroshilov was the war commissar and Stalin's buddy. He did not mention deep battle again, and neither did the Army's training plan issued for the 1937 year. However, the Army's Corps Field Manual issued that year, PU 36, did mention it. Tukhachevsky had a hand in writing it. Deep battle combined with deep operations was absolutely the way to go, but there were some tank modifications. That second defense suppression wave, the DPP, well, that went away. Tanks were now either close support or long-range penetration. But the purpose of the tank in both cases was the same: help the infantry. Either the infantry doing the attack on the front line or the infantry which was acting in depth. Interestingly, the majority of the manual revolved not around breaching fortified lines, but instead much more on hasty attacks from the march. It seemed to be assuming a generally fluid battlefield. In the meantime, in the world of amphibious tanks, the T-37A was succeeded by the T-38, which is basically an enlarged T-37A with the turret on the opposite side. The tank had greater range, and subtle modifications to the running gear meant that the tracks were far less likely to fall off, which was a known problem with the T-37A. Just over 1,200 T-38s would be built between 1936 and 1937. 1936 also brings us to the Spanish Civil War. As with other nations, the Soviets took a look at this European conflict and, like the Germans, they fought in it. The dominant conclusion seems to have been that given that this was a modern European war, the general gist of it was going to be what a modern war was going to be like. It's not that they didn't take correct notice of certain caveats, such as the fact that enemy tanks were lacking in anti-armor weaponry. It was T-26 versus Panzer I for much of it, and there was a conclusion that a major war would face an enemy armed with properly armed tanks. The Soviets were not pleased by the quality of radio communications, logistics, or the lack of coordination with infantry. The T-26s seemed to perform well as close infantry support though, which was fine, since that was what they were designed for. However, anti-tank defenses had grown far tougher than expected. AT guns were difficult to find, difficult to destroy, and pretty good at killing tanks. Remember, we're talking about nothing bigger here than the 45mm, more likely 37 and 20, so we're not looking at a huge signature here. On the other hand, a competent army would also have better artillery support than that which the Republicans provided, which might also protect the tanks a bit better, so it could be a wash. Not that Tukhachevsky or Kalepsky were given any particular input into the reporting. In early 1937 they were rounded up and shot. Actually, lots of people were rounded up in this one of Stalin's purges. 75% of various military districts officers were purged, for example. As if the Red Army didn't have enough problems getting its units to work together. And it wasn't just the officers. The purges happened everywhere, to include the tank design and manufacturing industry. Tank production in 1937 plummeted. Obviously, Tukhachevsky, who was in league with the Germans, had contaminated ideas. They could have been put forward to ensure Soviet doom. Perhaps this is why the Red Army was having difficulty placing the doctrine into practice. Tukhachevsky had deliberately come up with a way of reducing the Red Army to ineffectiveness in order to aid the Imperialists by sending them down this deep battle wild goose chase. Combine that with the information coming from Spain, including that unescorted tanks were dead meat to AT units without close infantry support, and well, this deep battle idea has some serious questions, and the focus obviously has to change. Also, tank platoons were brought back up to 5. 3s didn't seem to have enough firepower, at least according to the Spanish experience.
As a result, training evolutions from 1938 were focused on combined arms operations. You will recall Egorov, Chief of Staff of the Army, refined and worked on Tukhachevsky's deep battle. Survival instincts seem to have kicked in. He now joined Budenyi in emphasizing the importance of the bayonet attack, given the amount of close combat occurring in Spain. Survival instincts were not enough, and he was later purged as well. Couldn't really have been foreseen. It was a second purge. In 1938, 80% of battalion commanders and chiefs of staff were removed. These were the guys who accompanied commanders in 1937. A third purge got rid of their replacements as well. Some lieutenants went from company XO to division commander within 3 years. It was also obvious that nobody was about to rock the Doctrine boat. Shut the hell up, do nothing to attract attention to yourself, and go with whatever Voroshilov and his friends say. Also, mechanized units were reflagged as tank units with a much higher tank to infantry ratio. A tank brigade now had all of a company of troops. In effect, they were to become like the tank regiments, i.e. a supporting tool in the kit box that an overall commander could have. In the meantime, to solve the tank production problem, it was decided to rationalize the fleet. The general purpose tank would be an improved T-26. The BT would be evolved. A new heavy tank would be required. This one with actual armour, given that it seemed that T-28 and T-35 armour would not suffice, given what was going on in Spain. And a new amphibious tank would replace T-37A and T-38. The T-27s by this point had generally been relegated to artillery tractor duty. The T-26 variant never got anywhere, as the T-25 just didn't work, and neither did the ST-35, which is a simplified version. The evolved BT was to be the A-20, but the designer decided to make a heavier variant, A-32, while he was at it. The heavy tank, well, 3 designs were developed for the role. The light amphibious tank would become T-40, the first Soviet vehicle with torsion bars. Unfortunately, they didn't think to add shocks, so the things just bounced and rocked ridiculously to the discomfort of the crew. Only 132 were built by the German invasion, of which 18 were combat ready. Just to add to the Soviet problems, a little incident was brewing in the Far East, specifically at Lake Kazan. After the Japanese crossed the border, the Soviets took their time, drew up overwhelming forces, and then attacked. This was now an attack against an entrenched enemy in pretty poor terrain, and Soviet losses were hideous. They technically won, but it was something of a Pyrrhic victory. Officially, the reason was that the Far Eastern District Commander, Blücher, not the same guy from Waterloo, was at fault. He had not purged the ranks of enemies of the people, and had put people into positions who were unable to do their job. Which seems a bit counterintuitive. If he had purged them, they certainly wouldn't have been able to do their jobs. Blücher also did not survive the year, meeting his end in an NKVD cell in Moscow. Strange that. Starting to run out of apple juice. In the meantime, there was still the matter of what to do with all these tanks. The losses of so much armour against the Japanese indicated a problem. Voroshilov was of the opinion that the deep penetration tank idea was clearly discredited. At best, tanks would be used close to the front line to help the infantry, if not actually accompanying them. However, he refused to go as far as relegating tanks to self-propelled assault guns for the infantry. The state had spent a lot of money on these things, so somebody had damn well better find a use for them. The next set of instructions on armour did authorize the use of DD units to destroy enemy reserves and artillery, but it also said that the infantry commander had veto authority on that. Leading this charge to reduce independent operations was the Chief of Armour Directorate, Pavlov. The textbooks of 1939 destroyed even that DD option. The deep penetration group wasn't mentioned at all, and the attacks on the enemy's rear were given only a brief discussion. Infantry was placed front and centre of all other arms which were to support them. In effect, the manuals had gone back to 1921. There was a little caveat given to tank groups under very specific conditions of terrain and lack of enemy defenses for a move to the enemy's deeper areas, but it had to be well supported by air force and artillery. That was it. Enter then, stage right, Zhukov and his actions at Khalkhin-Gol. It's often considered that he used the discredited deep battle theory in his victory, although really it was more of a classic double envelopment. Punch through the weaker flanks and then move inwards to attack the enemy from all sides. In this, he combined the traditional use of tanks, artillery and aircraft to support infantry with the high-speed maneuver possibilities afforded by tanks and motorized artillery. That the Soviets didn't immediately think, oh, maybe deep battle was right after all, is not surprising, as the premise of deep battle or deep operations was more than simply being a war of maneuver. Reports from the after-action investigations indicated that the tanks without infantry were not as successful as tanks with infantry. One tank brigade, which haired off on its own, caused havoc for a while, but eventually had to return to its start point without any infantry to clear and hold. Another brigade made a tank-only attack against Japanese infantry who had barely arrived in position. The tanks won, but only after the Japanese had extracted a heavy toll of Soviet losses. Now, that said, they did work quite nicely as pillboxes in the defense, with some units moving to flank attacking Japanese as they charged at Soviet infantry, and others, well, they just sat with the infantry. So, no harm done. We can still disband the tank corps. They were intended for independent action and there's no point to them anymore. It happened that the war started before they could all be disbanded, and a tank corps did partake in the invasion of Poland. The operation did not go amazingly well. The Soviets lost some 350 of 1,700 tanks, which, considering they were attacking a Poland already well engaged at the front, is not really something to write home about. The tank's questionable success affirmed the decision to abandon the corps and to spread the tanks out amongst other units, to include assigning small numbers of tanks to quote-unquote mechanized rifle divisions. On the other hand, it was also concluded that the tanks needed to become more powerful than they already were. Enter the A-32 mentioned earlier, also stage right. A tank not specifically requested, but built because it could be. With more armour, a few detail changes and a new name, T-34, it would replace T-28 and T-26 to start with. They would not be ready for Finland, but just under 900 would be around for the German invasion. Unfortunately, just over 800 of them had never been driven outside of the factory acceptance trials and then to park them, in order to save on wear and tear. Only 46 vehicles were authorized for training purposes. As a result, T-34's introduction into battle would prove to be disappointing, with basically every single one of them being lost within a month and a half. Spoiler alert though, T-34 units do start sorting themselves out by the end of the year. Barely had the results of the Polish campaign been assessed that the Soviets decided to have a crack at the Finns. And as you may have seen, this did not end well for the Soviets. Tanks were either used in small numbers to support a massed infantry attack, or they were used in large numbers independently. The terrain conditions also, well, kind of sucked for tanks. After a bit of a ponder, the Red Army tried again. This time, tanks were applied in large numbers and in close support of the infantry. This worked. Again, though, something of a Pyrrhic victory. Some lessons were learned, of course. Firstly, there was a special platoon of heavy tanks created. The prototypes of SMK, T100 and KV were used together. The KV proved to be the best of the bunch, which was fortunate because 50 of them had already been ordered, and the tank would go on to cause the Germans much annoyance the following year. Secondly, small units of tanks were a silly idea. Independent companies and battalions generally needed to go away. The initial proposal from April 1940 combined them all into brigades of 4 battalions, thus concentration of armour would be assured. Thirdly, though working with infantry did seem to fare better, and indeed the tanks were often used to transport troops in the deep snow, there was the problem that the tanks and troops were simply not used to working together. By May 1940, the Commissariat for Defence had come up with a solution for these last 2 points. A tank division, consisting of 2 tank regiments, of 1 heavy tank battalion, 2 medium tank battalions, and a flamethrower tank battalion. It would also have an artillery regiment and a motorized rifle regiment. The troops in this regiment, being part of the tank division, would be trained in how to work effectively with tanks. That wasn't the end of it though. Something else happened in May of 1940. The Germans wiping the floor with the British and French, combined with all those propaganda newsreels of massed panzer units being the key to victory. There's a lesson in this, by the way. Come back next year for the American Doctrine video. The Germans were using corps of multiple panzer divisions together. Obviously, there was something to it, so those corps that had been disbanded were now coming back, albeit with a slightly different configuration. 8 of them, each with 2 armour and 1 motorized division. Of course, now that they were coming back, there was still the matter of just what to do with them. Obviously, some folks, such as Zukov, writing in December 1940, argued in favour of the German successes being a perfect example of deep continuous operations, and that a tank corps would be perfect for them. He also advocated for 3 waves of tanks, supported by artillery to destroy the front line, the last of which would help the infantry forward for the final blow with the bayonet. Sounds familiar. Others, perhaps closer than they would have known, argued that the German success may just have been a lucky break, and that such deep successes cannot be considered reliable, especially in cases where there may be fortifications. Sure, if the opportunity comes up, please go ahead and maraud in the enemy's rear, but you can't go about creating a doctrine based on hope. In the end, the answer was never really sorted out by the time that the Germans launched Barbarossa, and the initial Soviet responses tended to result in the tanks being used purely in support of infantry, with the unfortunate results that we are, in hindsight, aware of. So, that's how the Soviets went from using tanks as infantry support to deep maneuver to infantry support to deep maneuver in the interwar period, all while investing heavily in the tank as a weapon, even if they were never quite sure what to do with them. Hope you found the above interesting and informative. Please go ahead and check out my other videos on the topic, and I will see you on the next one. Take care.